Hello, everybody, and welcome to another in our series of weekly virtual field trips from the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York. Very glad to be with you today. And today we're going to be offering a special program, the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Negro Leagues baseball. The Negro Leagues, as we refer to them, the Negro Leagues of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even into the early 60s, they were essentially founded in February of 1920, 100 years ago. So that'll be our topic of conversation coming up today. We will take your questions in our Zoom group chat a little bit later on. So we're very glad that you could join us to talk about this important part of baseball history. It's really an extension of the civil rights program that we offer as an educational unit, both on-site and also through virtual field trips. But this one does focus exclusively on the Negro Leagues and the impact that they had. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Markison. I work in the Hall of Fame's Education Department. Very glad to be with you today. Prior to the start of the Negro Leagues, there were actually some other attempts at establishing formalized leagues for Black professional players. Go back to 1886. There was a league called the Southern League of Colored Baseballists, and that was launched. It had 10 teams, and they began play in June of 1886, but the league was not successful. It collapsed in its second month in July, basically went out of business, so that did not work out. The next year, 1887, another attempt was made in the form of the National Colored Baseball League. This time, 8 teams joined this NCBL, but they only played a handful of games. And in late May, after only 2 weeks of official play, the league folded up. So these 2 attempts were not very successful. They only lasted really a matter of weeks each time. Now, independent Black teams would continue to play after these failed league attempts. But African Americans, for a while, did not have a league to call their own. Well, that brings us to this man, Rube Foster. He wanted to change the landscape of baseball. And much like the organizers of the Southern League of Colored Baseballists and the National Colored Baseball League, Rube Foster had a dream of forming a league, professional league, where the best African-American players could play against each other in a competitive, organized way. So what happened was this: February 13th of 1920, the first in a series of 2 meetings that took place at a YMCA in Kansas City. And the meetings were led by Rube Foster. And it was there where really the initial organizing for what would become the Negro National League began. What I'd like to do now is actually read an excerpt from a book, and it's a book that we highly recommend. It's called Shades of Glory. It was a book that the Hall of Fame put out with National Geographic a number of years ago, written by Larry Hogan, one of the leading experts on Negro Leagues baseball. It's a terrific authority on the subject. And the book is an excellent history of the Negro Leagues, start to finish, and their impact over the years. I want to read from page 161 of Larry Hogan's book. Here's what he writes. If Rube Foster had done nothing else but play and manage the way that he did, Rube Foster, I should mention, before becoming an executive, was a player in independent Negro Leagues baseball. He also was the manager of a team called the Chicago American Giants. Behind me is a replica uniform of that Chicago franchise. So he was a player and he was a manager before becoming a team owner and then this league founder and executive. So if Rube Foster had done nothing but play and manage the way he did, he would be remembered in baseball annals. But he did much more. He was the key figure in bringing together on February 13th and 14th, 1920, at the Negro YMCA in Kansas City, the group of men who established the first National Black Baseball League at a gathering that Ira Lewis characterized as perhaps the most singular and noteworthy meeting ever held in the interest of our sport life. Ira Lewis was an early sports writer. Foster was aptly characterized as the league's, quote, active, militant, fighting head, unquote. Indication of how bold the move was, it was said at the time that only 3 of the 8 founding teams were paying their players a regular salary. A contemporary claimed that Andrew Rube Foster acted as he did at this time, quote, sensing the death of semi-pro baseball. After all that he and like-minded owners such as C.I. Taylor, J.L. Wilkinson, and Edward Bolden had done with their baseball teams from 1910 to 1920, a league of national scope was a natural next step. Again, that is from the book Shades of Glory, The History of Negro Leagues Baseball. So in 1920, Rube Foster convinces 7 other Midwestern team owners to join him in forming what would be known as the Negro National League. And this was the official start of what we call Negro Leagues baseball. 2 factors helped Foster start the Negro Leagues. First, between 1916 and 1919, 500,000 African Americans relocated to the North in what became known as the Great African American Migration. So with greater population bases, cities in the North could better support African American teams. Second, World War I had come to an end in 1918. People were now relieved about the end of the war. They were more interested by 1920 in heading to the ballpark to watch games in person. Now, Foster started his Negro National League in the Midwest because he had owned the Chicago American Giants. So he's based in the Windy City. He's in Chicago, Illinois. And the Midwest is where the franchises are located. You can see that there were teams in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Missouri. Now, in the Midwest, there was certainly an appetite, if you will, for professional baseball. The fans in the Midwestern part of the country were very much ready for the entertainment that baseball offered. Well, the Negro National League became very successful under Foster's visionary leadership. Soon, we have other leagues forming in eastern and southern states. We see East Coast franchises that are popping up in New York, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, among other places on the Eastern Coast. And the fans there were as receptive to Negro Leagues baseball as the fans in the Midwest had been as well. The Negro League certainly maintained a high level of professional skill, and the teams actually helped improve economic development in many Black communities. Now, Negro Leagues baseball starts in the Midwest, goes to the East Coast, very successful in both of those geographic regions. It eventually moves into the South, the Negro Southern League. And we would see franchises that were formed in places like Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia. And this was at a time when Jim Crow segregation was really at one of its worst levels. There was all sorts of segregation going on in terms of restaurants, cafes, diners, hotels, motels eventually would become segregated, particularly in the South. There were some areas of segregation in the North as well. But the Jim Crow segregation was usually at its strictest and at its fiercest in the southern states. And in spite of this, in spite of the roadblocks created, the teams traveling by bus, they come to roadside diners, oftentimes finding out that the owner of the diner will simply not serve them because of the color of the skin. They're told that the diner, the restaurant, is for white customers, white patrons only. Oftentimes, teams would arrive in cities where they were scheduled to play, and they would find there's not a single hotel that would cater to African-American clientele, especially in smaller towns, smaller cities. Bigger cities tended to have hotels that would cater to Black customers. But again, the smaller cities and some of the towns and the villages often could be a very difficult proposition finding places to stay. So in spite of these obstacles, we see Negro Leagues baseball also prospering in the southern part of the country. Now, as the Negro Leagues grow throughout the 1920s and 30s, we see a number of great players and great teams that emerged. Well, here's a fantastic team, the 1935 Pittsburgh CRAWFORDS. And they actually emerged as the champions of Negro Leagues baseball. They won the Negro Leagues World Series. Now, they had on their team, they had about 20 players. Generally, rosters for the Negro Leagues were smaller than Major League rosters. You know, today we think of rosters 25 players. Negro Leagues rosters were about 20 players. Of the 20 players, the Pittsburgh CRAWFORDS had 5 future Hall of Famers. Oscar Charleston, a great outfielder, Judy Johnson, third baseman, Cool Papa Bell, center fielder and leadoff man, Josh Gibson, all-world catcher, and the pitching ace, Hall of Famer, Satchel Paige. Well, all 5 of the Hall of Famers. So a quarter of the team's roster, Hall of Fame players. Now, we'll never know for sure, but there are some historians, some experts who have studied Negro Leagues history. They believe that if the Pittsburgh CRAWFORDS had been given a chance to play in the major leagues, there's a more than decent chance that they might have reached the World Series, maybe won the World Series for the major leagues in 1935. We'll never know for sure, but it was an incredibly dominant team full of talent. I mean, to have 5 future Hall of Famers, these guys really weren't at the end of their career. They were players that were still pretty much in their prime. So 5 out of 20 players destined for the Hall of Fame. Let's talk about some of these individual players. And let's begin with this man, the great Satchel Paige. He was a pitcher with a blazing fastball. They did not have radar gun readings back then, the way that eventually they would, starting probably in the 1960s, early 1970s. But there are some who estimate that Satchel Paige threw a fastball at his peak at about 100 miles an hour. He was one of the hardest throwers in the Negro Leagues, if not the hardest thrower in his early years. In addition to being an incredibly talented pitcher, he was considered one of the Negro League's most colorful characters and really its greatest gate attraction. Note on the right side of your screen where it says Victory Field, Indianapolis. That is a promotional poster. We call it in the museum trade a broadside. And this was a poster that would have been put up promoting Satchel Paige's appearance at an upcoming game. So this was Victory Field in Indianapolis. The sign probably would have been put up on fences, maybe telephone poles, somewhat close to the ballpark, letting people know that on Friday, August the 31st, there would be an exhibition game between the Kansas City Monarchs and the Harlem Stars. And at the very bottom of the screen, you can see the mention of Leroy Satchel Paige. Leroy was his first name, Satchel was his nickname. And the odds are that whenever Satchel Paige pitched, it was going to be either a capacity crowd or close to capacity crowd, because he was not only a great pitcher, he was a great showman. He was highly entertaining. And people loved to watch Satchel Paige pitch in person. Obviously, back then, we're talking about really the days before there was television coverage. There was really no television coverage for the Negro Leagues, and television coverage for Major League Baseball was really only starting to pick up steam later, probably 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s. So the opportunity to see Satchel Paige in person was a big deal. And this is why teams advertise his pitching appearances ahead of time. They knew they had a good chance to attract close to a sellout crowd. What we like to do now is show you a short video that we put together about Satchel Paige, give you an idea of what he looked like, what his pitching motion was like.
Satchel Paige was a special.
Here we see Satchel with one of the teams for which he dominated, the Kansas City Monarchs. Here he is throwing on the sidelines at Wrigley Field in Chicago. There you can see him toward the end of his pitching delivery. You're going to notice with Satchel Paige that he had a very long stride toward home plate, and he also featured a very high leg kick. Look how high that front leg is. Very distracting to the hitter. Probably hard for hitters to pick up the baseball with that leg kind of getting in the way. Paige pitched for a number of teams. He tended to jump from one team to another because he was always in high demand, and he knew that if he kind of played one bidder against another, he could get the optimum contract that he was looking for. He also barnstormed in places like Mexico. He had his own team, the Satchel Paige All-Stars. And as you see here with the Cleveland Indians, he did have the opportunity to play Major League Baseball toward the latter stages of his career. Starting in 1948, he joined the Cleveland Indians, and then after that, he pitched for the St. Louis Browns. And he had some pretty good seasons as a major leaguer, particularly coming out of the bullpen. But really, his prime years were spent in the 20s, the 30s, the early 40s, when he was pitching for Negro Leagues teams. Now, here we see two photographs of Satchel at very different points in his career. As I said before, he actually started 1927. Here's an early photo of him with the Monarchs. This is from the 1930s. And then you can contrast it with the photograph on the right when Satchel is getting ready to pitch in an exhibition game at the Astrodome in the 1960s. So here's a guy, he pitched in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 5 different decades. I mean, 4 decades is pretty darn good, but he appeared in 5 different decades during the course of his career. Now, some of you might be saying, gee, I don't remember Paige pitching for the Houston Astros. It was not actually a regular season game. It was an exhibition game, a preseason game that was played at the Houston Astrodome. I think it might have been the first year of the Astrodome, either 65 or maybe 1966. It was in that vicinity. So it was not an official regular game, but it was an exhibition game. And actually, a couple of years later, 1968, he pitched in at least one spring training game for the Atlanta Braves, but did not make the opening day roster, did not pitch in a regular season game. So technically, never pitched for the Astros or the Braves in a regular season play, but he did make pitching appearances at a rather advanced age in exhibition games for both of these franchises. Now, here is a team he did pitch for in the regular season. It was 1965 for the Kansas City Athletics. And Satchel Paige actually set a record, became the oldest player to ever appear in a game at the age of 59. He came in relief in that game, and he did pretty darn well. He pitched 3 scoreless innings of relief against the Boston Red Sox, who had some heavy hitters at the time, including Carl Yastrzemski. So here he is, age of 59. He comes in, he pitches 3 scoreless innings of relief. A lot of people were stunned by this, thought that he might appear in another game or two, but actually this was the only appearance. He basically was brought back by the owner, Charlie Finley, in order to help him qualify for a better major league pension. And this actually turned out, this game, 1965, turned out to be the final regular season game that he ever pitched in the major leagues. His career spanned a remarkable 40 years, 1927 to 1966. Just amazing how great a shape he kept himself in. I mean, look how thin he is. Facially, you could see that he had aged by this point, but in terms of the body, he had not put on a lot of weight, was still in very good athletic condition, especially for a man who was approaching his 60th birthday. So Paige is one of the great Negro Leagues players. Here is another, Josh Gibson. He is really regarded as the greatest home run hitter in the history of Negro Leagues baseball. He was a feared slugger. He was also a very skilled defensive catcher. He was not just a one-dimensional player. He could hit and he could catch really well. We don't know how many home runs he hit in official Negro Leagues games simply because record keeping, the statistics for the Negro Leagues are just not that complete. One of the problems was in the Negro Leagues, you played a certain number of games within the league against other league teams, but then teams played a lot of outside exhibition games where they would play against local teams, in some cases non-professional teams. So those exhibition games, those records would not officially count toward the Negro League statistics. And even just trying to find statistics for the actual Negro Leagues games is often difficult. Sometimes there are box scores, sometimes there was newspaper coverage, but that was not always the case. So the record keeping is not that complete. I think it's probably safe to say that he hit at least 150 to maybe 200, 250 home runs in Negro Leagues competition. You might say, well, that's not that many. Well, consider that a typical Negro League schedule, a typical Negro Leagues season was much shorter than a Major League season, which at the time would have been 154 games. They weren't playing nearly as many league games. So there was not that opportunity to hit as many home runs. Due to his remarkable power, Gibson was sometimes called the Black Babe Ruth. Sadly, unlike Satchel Paige, he never received the chance to play Major League Baseball. He developed a brain tumor at a very young age. He chose not to have it treated through surgery. He just sort of, kind of struggled through it. He ended up sadly passing away at a very young age. He died in January of 1947, succumbing to the effects of the brain tumor. Look at the timeline. January of 47, that's when he passes away. Only 3 months later, a man named Jackie Robinson breaks through the color barrier. It was April 15th of that same year, and he makes his Major League debut for the Brooklyn Dodgers. No question that Gibson had the talent to play in the Major Leagues, but obviously the segregated baseball situation, the Jim Crow segregation that affected baseball, and his own poor health tragically prevented Gibson from ever playing in the Major Leagues. Here's another man who did not play in the Major Leagues, not for tragic reasons, but simply because of age. His name, James Cool Papa Bell. He was a center fielder. He was considered by many to have been the fastest man in Negro Leagues history. Reportedly, he could run all the way around the bases. So from home to first, first to second, second to third, third to home in 12 seconds flat, which is remarkable. Catcher Ted Double Duty Radcliffe, who was a pretty good player in and of himself, once said about Cool Papa Bell, if he bunts and it bounces twice, put the ball in your pocket. If it bounced twice on the ground, you simply were not going to have enough time to get Cool Papa Bell out at first base. He was an extraordinary player, a great center fielder, played shallow, the way that you're fundamentally taught to play the outfield. Great speed, great leadoff man. But by the time baseball integrated, by the time Major League Baseball allowed Jackie Robinson to play, 1947, Cool Papa Bell had retired as an active player. He had moved on to doing other things, including work as a coach and as an instructor, but the timeline for his playing had pretty much elapsed, and it just didn't work out in terms of getting that Major League opportunity. I want to highlight one other player from the Negro Leagues, and he's a player that's often overlooked. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about Paige, you've heard about Gibson, you've heard about Cool Papa Bell. Not as many fans know about Oscar Charleston, partly because he played in the early years of the Negro Leagues. He played in the 1920s when the league was starting out and had not yet gained its reputation for terrific play, was not yet getting the publicity that really would peak in the 1930s. Well, some who saw him play say that Charleston was the greatest Negro Leagues player of the 1920s. He was an outfielder, and he had tremendous speed and range, generally played center field. But he was also a fantastic hitter, hit for average. He won 2 batting championships. He also played with the aggressiveness of Ty Cobb. He was a daring base runner. He would slide hard into the bases. He had kind of a quick temper. If he thought another player was, trying to intimidate him, he didn't like that. So he had that fiery aggressiveness that Ty Cobb had. But in addition to all that, he had tremendous power too. I mean, the guy hit home runs. He won some home run titles playing in the Negro Leagues. Simply had no flaw as a player, just a phenomenal player during the 1920s. Now, at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, we collect artifacts and we collect documents. Here's an example of a document that we have that relates directly to the history of the Negro Leagues. As you can see on the left side of your screen, it is a souvenir program. And it's from something called the Negro World Series at Ruppert Stadium. It's home of the Newark Eagles, winner of the Negro National League, taking on the Kansas City Monarchs, the winner of the Negro American League. Well, just those few words there, Negro World Series, that tells us a lot. It tells us that the Negro Leagues had their own World Series, just like the Major Leagues had the World Series featuring the champions of the National League and the champions of the American League. So Negro Leagues baseball was serious baseball. Not only did they want to determine league champions, they wanted to determine a champion overall. And throughout the Negro Leagues, there were multiple leagues. I mentioned the Negro National League, there was the Negro American League, there was the ECL, the Eastern Colored League, there was the Southern League, many other leagues as well. Some seasons you had 2, 3, 4 different Negro Leagues that were operating, but they liked to determine a sole champion for the entire body of the Negro Leagues. So that's what they're doing here. And this was actually during the 1946 season when the Newark Eagles took on the KC Monarchs. Now, if you look at the right side of this souvenir program, you'll see a typewritten message. I'll read it out loud. The Newark Eagles, winner of both halves in the 1946 season, thank the fans for their loyal support. And then underneath that statement, we see the name of Effa Manley. Now, when we do this program in terms of a virtual field trip just for students, I'll often ask the kids, who is Effa Manley? And I'll give them a hint and say, well, she was not a player. She was not a manager. She did something else. Some people will guess that she was an umpire. Eventually, though, they'll guess that, yes, she worked in the front office. In fact, she was the owner of the team. Effa Manley and her husband, Abe, were the longtime owners of the Newark Eagles franchise. And Effa Manley was considered one of the best and fairest owners in all of Negro Leagues baseball. She had a reputation for really treating the players well. I'll give you some examples. You look at the bottom of your screen here. You can see a bus, and it actually has stamped on it Newark Eagles Baseball Club. This was their official team bus. This was an air-conditioned bus. Now, this is back in the 1940s. Air-conditioned buses were not as common as they would become today, and they were pretty darn expensive. Yet, Effa Manley wanted her players traveling in as comfortable an environment as possible. They're playing during the heat of the summer. It's a relatively cramped bus, trying to fit 20 players along with the manager and coaches. So she wanted the players to have the best possible conditions. So an air-conditioned bus, that was pretty unusual for Negro Leagues baseball at the time. Also, when the team was traveling and they would come to the next town where they were going to stay, Effa always tried to find accommodations that were the best available. She tried to find the best hotel in that city or town that would cater to African-American citizens. So she was actually willing to spend more money to ensure the comfort of her players, which in turn would perhaps result in better play as well. She was considered fairly generous, as team owners would be considered. We know that, in the history of baseball, especially prior to things like free agency and arbitration, we know that owners didn't always want to give as much money to the players as certainly the players would like. But Effa Manley was known as paying the players well above average salaries for the Negro Leagues. So she really made sure to treat her players very, very well. There's also another interesting component to Effa Manley's story. And it has not just to do with baseball, but it has to do with civil rights. One of the things that Effa Manley used to do at Ruppert Stadium in Newark, where the Eagles played, she would hold civil rights nights at the ballpark. This was a way to promote the cause of civil rights, to promote awareness of civil rights. She also became very involved in the community. One year, she found out that department stores in Harlem, New York City, were not hiring African-American clerks to work at the stores. She organized a boycott of several of these department stores and basically was able to coordinate an effort where many African-Americans refused to buy products at that department store. And this boycott was so successful that eventually it pressured some of the department store owners into changing their hiring practices and bringing in more African-American clerks and employees. So she had a very significant influence, contribution to the American Civil Rights Movement, particularly in the 1940s. Because of what she did as an owner, because of her contributions to civil rights, Effa Manley elected to the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. It was 2006. There was a specially formed Black Baseball Hall of Fame ballot, and she was one of 17 new Hall of Famers elected from the Negro Leagues and some of those early Black professional teams that predated the Negro Leagues. So Effa Manley was part of that special election, and her plaque is now featured at the Hall of Fame's plaque gallery. It is in the rotunda at the very end of the plaque gallery. Now, there were women who played in the Negro Leagues. This is a story that's not as well known as some of the other aspects of Negro Leagues history. Research that has been done by a number of very fine researchers, Leslie Heafy, who is a tremendous expert on Negro Leagues baseball. She has done research into this. Other writers and researchers have looked into this. They have determined that at least 12 women played in the Negro Leagues. Now, the three most prominent are shown here in this newspaper clipping: Toni Stone, Mamie Peanut Johnson, and Connie Morgan. At one time, it was believed they were the only three, but we now believe they were 3 of 12, that there were 12 women total that played. Now, it's interesting because if you look back when this happened, this was early 1950s. Look at Major League Baseball. Actually, Major League Baseball had an official rule on the books banning women from playing. And then if you look at the All-American Girls Baseball League, which started in 1943 and continued until 1954, they actually banned African-American women from playing in the league. Only white women were allowed to play in the AAGPBL. So the Negro Leagues was doing something very different from the All-American League and from Major League Baseball. So why did they do this? Why were they kind of pioneers in this sort of thing? Why did they have these 12 different women, including Stone, Johnson, and Morgan, play for some of their teams? Well, it really had to do with economic reasons. By the early 1950s, the Negro Leagues were losing a lot of their top players to Major League Baseball, as baseball is integrating more and more heavily. So the quality of play in the Negro Leagues is going down, especially the star quality, the big star players. So attendance starts to fall off at Negro Leagues games. Some of the Negro Leagues owners, including the owners of the Indianapolis Clowns and the Kansas City Monarchs, they thought, you know, if we have women players, that may draw some more fans to the games. And we think it may have worked, at least in the short term. Probably was not a long-term solution. Well, definitely was not a long-term solution to the attendance problems, but it did help in the short term. These three ladies, though, they were all pretty darn good players, and they more than held their own. Toni Stone, in particular, was considered a very good athlete, good second baseman. One time, rather famously, she picked up a hit against Satchel Paige. Now, the negative to this story is that these women were not treated particularly well by most of the other players in the league. Most of the men in the Negro Leagues did not want to play with or against female players. So it was a very difficult circumstance that these three ladies and the other 9 women faced. Now, Toni Stone and Connie Morgan, they have passed away a number of years ago. Mamie Peanut Johnson only passed away within a couple of years ago. She actually came up, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, to the museum. And she was here for a program honoring Monet Davis, the young African-American girl who did so well pitching Little League Baseball, appeared on the cover of Sports Illustrated and was featured on ESPN. She actually came up, did Mamie Peanut Johnson for that program with Monet Davis. And it was great to see these 2 generations, long span of time between their playing careers, but African-American female players having dominance in the game. It was really quite something to have them both here in the museum at the same time. Let's talk about another person, a man who had tremendous impact on the league in many ways, and that was Buck O'Neil, such an important part of Negro Leagues history. He was a very fine first baseman, didn't hit with a lot of power, but hit for a high average, very good fielder. Then after his playing days, well, actually for a while, he became a player manager, and then when he retired as a player, he continued to manage the Kansas City Monarchs. He had a lot of success there. In fact, he managed the Monarchs to 2 league championships. Later, he left the Negro Leagues, and he actually was employed by the Chicago Cubs organization as both a scout and as a coach. As a scout, he signed a player named Lou Brock, Hall of Famer, to his first professional contract. Of course, Brock became a Hall of Famer with the St. Louis Cardinals, but he did begin his career with the Chicago Cubs before they made that ill-fated trade, sending him to St. Louis for the pitcher Ernie Banks. Well, that trade wasn't Buck's fault. Buck had signed Lou Brock for the Chicago Cubs, where he played for a couple of seasons before really putting it together as a star in St. Louis. Buck also signed a number of other major leaguers, one of the more notable ones, Oscar Gamble, who would become a very good player, good platoon player, would have a long career lasting into the early to mid 1980s. And of course, here at the Hall of Fame, we have an award that we give out, the Buck O'Neil Award. It's essentially a lifetime achievement award. It's such a prestigious award that is only given out once every 3 years. And when you come to the Hall of Fame, and you go past the ticket booth, just to the right of our staircase, you see the statue we have erected to Buck O'Neil, and you'll see a plaque indicating those who have won the Buck O'Neil Award. Well, speaking of the Kansas City Monarchs, the team that Buck O'Neil played for and then managed, let's talk about Jackie Robinson. He actually, at the start of his professional career, played in the Negro Leagues. 1945, he was playing shortstop for the Kansas City Monarchs, hitting well over 300. Well, Branch Rickey, who was the part owner and the vice president of the Brooklyn Dodgers, he's starting to think about his plan to integrate the game. He's trying to decide which player do we want to draw from the Negro Leagues? Who is going to be not only the player, but the right man for this job? And ultimately, of course, he selected Jackie Robinson. What he did was, during that 1945 season, Rickey dispatched one of his scouts, Clyde Sukeforth, a great baseball mind. Sukeforth met with Robinson. He actually was supposed to see him play, and I believe the game got rained out. But Sukeforth made sure to kind of sit down and not necessarily interview Robinson, but have a conversation with him. I'm sure he asked him some questions. Sukeforth came away very impressed with Robinson's character and personality. And when he went back to Branch Rickey, he essentially recommended that Rickey seriously consider signing Robinson in terms of having the right character, the right temperament, the right personality. And that was one of those early steps that led to Rickey and the Dodgers signing Jackie Robinson. He actually signed with the Dodgers organization late in the 1945 season. And then, of course, he moved up to the major leagues 2 years later, making his debut April 15th of 1947, but got his pro start playing in the Negro Leagues. And there you see him with his Monarchs uniform. And there's Rickey when they first signed that contract, late summer, early fall of 1945. Let's talk about some other great players who would become, superstars in the major leagues, but essentially got their starts playing in the Negro Leagues. On the left, we see Hank Aaron. He played for the Indianapolis Clowns. He was actually a shortstop for the most part. When the Braves would get him, they would convert him to the outfield. But he played shortstop for the Indianapolis Clowns, played there one season, batted .366 over about a 25 to 30 game span. So obviously the Braves, they were very impressed. They signed him when they were still the Boston Braves. And the next season they moved to Kansas City. They moved to, not Kansas City, they moved to Milwaukee and became the Milwaukee Braves. And it was in Milwaukee where Hank Aaron would make his major league debut. In the middle, we see Ernie Banks. Ernie Banks played for the Kansas City Monarchs, and he actually played for Buck O'Neil, often credited Buck as being one of the guys who really taught him the game at an early age. He was a tremendous influence on Ernie Banks. And then on the right, you see an action shot of the great Willie Mays. Willie Mays also played Negro Leagues baseball. He actually played 4 seasons for the Birmingham Barons before eventually getting a contract with the New York Giants. So not only do the Negro Leagues have established stars like we talked about earlier, Page and Gibson, Bell and Charleston, but they also had these great young talents who shined for a brief time in the Negro Leagues before eventually becoming superstars at the major league level. Let's now talk about the Negro Leaguers and their impact here in Cooperstown. For a number of years, Negro Leaguers were not eligible for a Hall of Fame election. Now, you could have split your career between the Negro Leagues and the Major Leagues, but the voters, when looking at your accomplishments, they were only supposed to look at what you did in the Major Leagues. And no one was being elected based solely on what they did in Negro Leagues competition. Well, in 1966, Ted Williams delivered his induction speech just outside my office in Cooper Park. That's where the inductions used to be. And during the speech, he made a point of saying that he hoped very shortly to see Negro League standouts honored with election and enshrinement in Cooperstown. So he made this celebrated speech in 1966. 5 years later, 1971, well, the Williams influence is felt. And that's when the Hall of Fame's board of directors, they changed the rules. And they decided, yeah, it's appropriate that we have Hall of Famers based on what they've done in the Negro Leagues. Special committee was formed strictly to look at Negro Leagues players each year. 1971 was the first year of the committee. And that year, they came up with Satchel Paige. He was the first player to be elected to Cooperstown based on what he had done in the Negro Leagues. Now, he did pitch, as I said, with a couple of major league teams, the Indians and the St. Louis Browns. But the reason he's Hall of Famer primarily is because of the dominance that he had for so many decades playing in the Negro Leagues. That photograph taken summer of 1971, right on the front steps, right in front of the library out in Cooper Park, just a stone's throw from where I am here in the Hall of Fame offices. You might be wondering why I'm in the Hall of Fame offices, and I'm going to tell you why in a couple of moments. Now, let's talk about some of the other. Well, actually, before we get to some of the others, I want to talk a little more about Satchel Paige. Again, reviewing that he pitched for the Indians, the St. Louis Browns in his 40s. came back to pitch for the Kansas City A's at the age of 59. And just an incredible career. His Negro Leagues tenure, 1926 to 1947. Here is Satchel Paige's plaque, which you can find chronologically arranged in the Hall of Fame. It's in the section in the early 1970s. It doesn't list all of his Negro Leagues teams. He actually played for so many teams it might not be physically possible to show them all on a plaque. But it does indicate the major league teams that he played for: Cleveland, St. Louis, and Kansas City. So that's Paige's plaque. It's been here since 1971. 1972, the second election for Negro Leagues greats, and that's when they got around to electing Josh Gibson. Phenomenal player. As it says on the plaque, considered greatest slugger in Negro baseball leagues. Power hitting catcher, hit almost 800 home runs. We now believe that that's an exaggeration. We don't think he hit that many. But there's little doubt that he was a dominant player during his 17-year career. He also won several Negro National League batting championships, 1936, 38, 42, and 45. Also in 1972, we have the election of Buck Leonard. I haven't talked about Buck Leonard. He was a great power-hitting first baseman. Some called him the Lou Gehrig of the Negro Leagues. He was a phenomenal player. He played for several teams, including the Homestead Grays. For a while, he formed an incredible middle-of-the-order tandem with Josh Gibson. Imagine having to face Gibson and Leonard back-to-back in the same lineup. Won a batting title, 1948, batted .391. It was the best batting average in the Negro National League. So these three, Leonard, Gibson, Paige, the first three elected to the Hall of Fame based on their Negro Leagues accomplishments. We're now up to a total of 35 players who have been elected to Cooperstown for what they did as Negro League standouts. Just a couple of other things that I want to mention. You might have heard the news that came out yesterday. I was hinting at this just a moment ago. The expectation is that the Hall of Fame will be opening tomorrow, Friday, the 26th of June. We're very excited about that. We will be opening, we anticipate, 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. And if you do come to the Hall of Fame, whether it's this weekend or whenever, some of the things that we have in our museum that tie into Negro Leagues history, actually, when you first come in the front door into the main lobby, you'll see our three character and courage statues. On the left is Lou Gehrig. On the right is Roberto Clemente. In the middle, Jackie Robinson, the man who broke the color barrier after starring for 1 year with the Kansas City Monarchs. So that's one of the exhibits that has somewhat of a connection to the Negro Leagues. You have Pride and Passion on the second floor. This is an entire exhibit, not just about the Negro Leagues, but really about the entire African-American baseball experience. Goes back to the earlier part of the 1800s, the many struggles that were faced in terms of overcoming Jim Crow segregation, some of these early efforts at forming leagues, and then ultimately the successful effort by Rube Foster to form the Negro National League in 1920. A couple of artifacts that you see there. The cap is a Brooklyn Dodger cap, and that is one of the caps that Jackie Robinson used. It's currently not in the exhibit. It's currently in storage. But when we redo this exhibit in a couple of years, very possible that the cap will be put into Pride and Passion. Now, the other item is currently in Pride and Passion, and that is a ticket that you see in the upper right-hand corner. You'll see the word colored on it. It's actually a segregated ticket. It's a ticket from a minor league game circa 1953-54. It was a minor league team, the Eastman, Georgia Dodgers, and it's a very small item. When you come to the museum, look in Pride and Passion, you can very easily go past it because it is small, but it's in one of the cases. And its significance is pretty powerful because it tells us, it reminds us that the segregation that affected baseball didn't just affect the players on the field. It affected the fans in the stands. And this was early 1950s. This was several years after Jackie Robinson starts the process of integrating the game on the field. Segregation was continuing in many of the southern ballparks, especially in minor league cities. And that ticket is certainly a reminder of that. So those are some of the items that we'd like you to look out for as we continue to celebrate throughout the year the 100th anniversary of Negro Leagues baseball. We do have a few minutes left, and I'd like to take your questions now, which we can do in the chat room. And so we certainly encourage you to pose questions. We have a question from Mike Swartz. How many games were played in an average Negro League season? It's difficult to answer, Mike, because it really kind of varied from team to team, season to season. But most of these Negro League seasons, from the research I've done, were well under 100 games. Now, they would play games throughout the summer. They would barnstorm. They would travel kind of independent of the league, and they would play local teams and semi-pro teams and amateur teams in exhibition games. So they were constantly playing games day after day after day. But in terms of actual league contests, where two league teams got together, those happened less frequently. And as I said, most of the seasons well under 100 games. I've seen seasons that were kind of in the range 45 to about 65 games. So it was not nearly as long as the 154 game season that Major League Baseball would have had at the time. Micah asked an interesting question. Who was your favorite player in the Negro Leagues? And that's a tough question to answer because obviously, I think like most of our audience, I'm not old enough to have seen Negro Leagues baseball. There's very little video that carries over. So we're sort of following it retroactively now. And we're going mostly on the stories and the few statistics that we have. In terms of personality, hard to beat Satchel Paige, who's such a colorful guy, such an unpredictable person in terms of his behavior, but a phenomenal player on the field. I guess in some ways, Josh Gibson is the guy that I really would have loved to have seen play. People that saw him, some say that he was the greatest catcher they ever saw in terms of both fielding and hitting. You put the package together. He was tremendous. I did see Johnny Bench play, and it's hard to believe that anybody could be better than Johnny Bench. But Josh Gibson, from the accounts that we've read, seemed to be in that same category with great players like Johnny Bench. He's a guy I really would have loved to have seen play. Tremendous power. Not only hit a lot of home runs, but tended to hit home runs of kind of gargantuan length. Not many of his home runs were really measured the way that they would be in later years. You think of Willie Stargell, a lot of his home runs were measured during the 1970s. He hit some long blasts, Dodger Stadium, Three Rivers Stadium, where the Pirates played for a number of years. It's hard to say exactly how long some of these Josh Gibson home runs were, but he had tremendous power. And when he hit home runs, they were no doubters more often than not. So I think he's, in some ways, he would have been a favorite. He would have been a guy that I really would have liked to have seen play. Graham Jones wants to know who was the best Negro Leagues player. That's really impossible for me to answer. There were so many greats. We've talked about some of the guys at the top of that stratosphere. Josh Gibson, Buck Leonard, Oscar Charleston, Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell. Those were just a few. And there were many other greats too. You think of third baseman, Judy Johnson is a name that comes to mind. Among shortstops, Willie Wells was a fantastic player. Biz Mackey was a great catcher, especially in terms of just the defensive side of the game. Lots of great players. It's really impossible for me to give you an answer in terms of one, but I can certainly at least give you a group of players to consider. Again, if you have a question, just jump into the Zoom group chat, type your question, and I will do my best to answer it in the couple of moments that we have. Here's a really good question from Ken Krawchuk. Were games reported on in newspapers of the day? That's a terrific question. Most of the coverage for the Negro Leagues came from the Black-owned newspapers, the black press of the day. Newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, major cities like a Pittsburgh, a Kansas City, Chicago had the Chicago Defender. These major cities had black-owned newspapers, and they provided quite a bit of the coverage of Negro Leagues baseball. In terms of the mainstream press really did not pay a lot of attention to the Negro Leagues. So much of the media coverage came from the black press of the day back in the 1930s and 40s. Sean Flanberg has a question. Is there a video for the public to see of Satchel Paige's induction speech? I'm sure it was entertaining. I would agree with you, Sean. I'm sure it was entertaining. I have not seen that video. I'm going to have to take a closer look in our collection. We do have videotape film of a number of Hall of Fame speeches. And certainly I think we have pretty much all of them from like 1980 on. I don't know about the Satchel Paige speech. I've never seen it. So I'm going to have to look into that a little bit further. And maybe I'll do a post one day on our Facebook page about that if I can find an answer. My hunch is it does not exist, but I don't know that for sure. I certainly have not seen it in the years since I've been working here at the Hall of Fame. I have seen excerpts of the Ted Williams speech when he called for Satchel Paige and other Negro Leagues greats to be elected to the Hall of Fame. I haven't seen the whole speech. I've only seen kind of snippets of it here and there, but I have not seen the Satchel Paige speech from 1971. Well, some excellent questions. We want to thank you for joining us over this past hour. This special program that we're doing in 2020, the 100th anniversary of the Negro Leagues. They started on those cold February days in Kansas City, 1920, 100 years ago. Thank you for joining us. Again, we are expecting to open our doors as of tomorrow, Friday, June 26th, starting at 9 a.m. I've been wanting to say that for a long time, and we finally get to say it today. Thanks again for being with us for this special virtual field trip from the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.